Unlike last year, the American League Central is going to be tough to survive. Will the Royals be one of those survivors? We'll talk about it next on this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I am your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. You also can catch us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey, and we're on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you are a first-time listener and you want to know a little bit more about me and this show, we come to you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Not always during the same time, but when you see an episode, it's going to be 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. But if you want to check me out on other platforms, I work over at Sports Radio 810 WHB, doing some hosting, co-hosting, and some producing as well. In fact, for today and tomorrow, you might have been able to catch me yesterday. I've been filling in for Seren Petro on the program. So if you want to hear me talk Royals, NFL, NBA, NHL, college, all that type of stuff, you can find me there from 2 to 6 over the next few days. But other than that, I spend most of my time co-hosting on The Zone from 10 to 12 and then doing some producing behind the scenes. But as I said, this episode, most of our episodes are just going to be talking about the Royals for 30 straight minutes. Now, today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnMLB and use code LockedOnMLB for a first deposit match of up to $100. I understand that yesterday I might have led people in the wrong direction, thinking that our Tuesday episode was going to be dedicated to recapping tonight's game between the Royals and Marlins, game 2 of that series at Kauffman Stadium. But with my schedule later on tonight, instead of posting a video at midnight or 1 a.m., which is what it was going to have to be because of my schedule, I thought it'd be a good time to get out ahead of it and do an afternoon episode. So if you are off work early or you are working and you wanted to listen to a podcast, hopefully I can provide that for you. So we do have a little bit of a change up in what we're going over today. We are going to talk about the bullpen, kind of switching around guys and one arm that has seemingly found his footing in the bullpen, and I think is thrusting himself back into a spot of trustworthiness with the Royals coaching staff and putting him in big time spots as he was last night. But to kick off the show, I want to evaluate the American League Central and go back to this offseason, go back to our American League Central preview with other Locked On hosts that featured Cleveland Guardians Locked On host. We had Minnesota, we had Royals, of course, and then we also had, who am I leaving out here? We had everybody but the White Sox. We had, and Detroit as well. I apologize for that. I was blanking out the top of my head who I already had said and who I hadn't just yet. But I remember specifically in that American League Central, the common thought that we all had, the consensus that we had, was that there was going to be Minnesota at the top, Chicago at the bottom, and then those 3 teams in the middle, being Cleveland, being Kansas City, and being Detroit. They are all right around each other. One of them, if they finish in second place, they're likely only a few games ahead of the 4th place finisher. However, things have just not gone that way at all. Our predictions, our thoughts on the American League Central are drastically different now because tonight is game 81. We will be halfway through the season, and the American League Central will have 3 teams with a winning record, and one of them tied for the best record in the American League in terms of winning percentage and being 24 games over 500, and that's the Cleveland Guardians. I don't think anybody envisioned them being on a pace like they are right now to have multiple winning streaks of 5-6 games or more, and doing so with largely the same team as last year, and doing so without their ace in the rotation. They've done it with a fantastic bullpen, of course, having Jose Ramirez and Stephen Kwan being big-time bats at the top of the order has led the way for them. But 50-26 is what we all expected from the Dodgers, what we expected from the Yankees, even the Orioles. And those teams are all hovering around that. But nobody expected Cleveland to be at that point. They now have an 8-game lead over Minnesota. They have a 9-game lead over Kansas City. And I think at this point, running away with the division. The Royals will see them this coming Thursday through Sunday. It'll be at Kauffman Stadium. And they won't see Cleveland again for quite some time. But it's a 4-game series, and it is, in my opinion, the last chance, even though there is July, August, and September. It is truly the last chance to make a serious push at Cleveland. And I don't think this Royals team is going to win the division. I understand that 8 or 9 games can dwindle down to 4 or 5 in just a bad week. But the way Cleveland has looked and the way they haven't dropped off at all kind of tells you that the proof is right there. This Cleveland team is going to get close to 100 wins unless injuries riddle them. If injuries riddle them, we're talking about a different story here. But they've pretty much stayed healthy, and they're doing it with a very young roster. I believe the youngest roster in Major League Baseball. They have a rookie manager in Stephen Vogt. He's done a great job, and if the Royals don't make the playoffs, I'd imagine that award is going to go to Stephen Vogt for the AL's best manager. And maybe even if the Royals do make the playoffs, you give it to Stephen Vogt if Cleveland has the number 1 seed and wins over 100 games. But this coming weekend, in my opinion, is that last push because they'll be coming off a Baltimore series. They already won game 1 against an Orioles team that is on a little bit of a skid, but it's still Baltimore and it's still Camden Yards. They win game 1. If Cleveland gets out of that series with a series win, or even if they drop the series, they drop the last 2. And if the Royals win the last 2, that'll put them 7 games back. If the Royals do win 3 of 4 in that series, which is going to be a daunting task, you look at them being, what would that be? That would add an extra 2 games. So you'd be 5 back. You'd be 5 back nearing the All-Star break. And you would have won 5 of your first, what would that be? 6, if you do sweep Miami, it'd be 6 of 7 on the homestand. And pretty firmly put you back into the wild card picture. But this is more so about the division. A lot of it also comes down to Minnesota, who's gotten really hot of late. The cool thing about it, though, because I know there's a lot of scoreboard watching among the listeners, among the followers, and I understand that it's frustrating to see Cleveland keep piling up the wins. It was frustrating to see Minnesota beat up on a bad schedule. And the Royals, all the while, went 8-18 in a 26-game stretch, and they lost their lead to Minnesota. They lost their wild card spot. However, they win tonight. Boston loses. They're right back in the wild card picture. They have the 6th seed in the American League. But what I think is really cool about this is going back to that American League Central preview, we all discussed the fact that the winner of that division, which we all, I think, unanimously decided it to be Minnesota, we all thought that it would be kind of not a fake award, but just not as glamorous as winning the East, even not as glamorous as winning the West, which is now turned to the American League Central of last year, having only 1 team over 500. No, the cool thing about this now is if the American League Central sends 3 teams, holds half the spots of playoff spots in the American League, well, then you can say every one of those teams truly earned it. And whether they go far or not, it's hard to compete in a division in which you have 3 teams playing in October. Not even the Royals in 14 and 15 had to worry about that. They had the Tigers in the playoffs in 2014, and I believe in 2015, there was no other team from the American League Central, unless I'm blanking on somebody. But this year, I think there's a lot of honor in going to the playoffs if you played in the American League Central. And no, they're not the star-studded division like the AL East is. I would hate to be somebody like Tampa Bay or Toronto that are not, unbelievably, scuffling. I know that the Blue Jays have lost 7 in a row. Tampa's won now, I think, 3 of 4 or 4 in a row. But they're just buried in their own division because the Yankees are right up there. because the Orioles are right up there. And now because Boston holds a wild card spot, I mean, these two divisions are not quite interchangeable, but record-wise, they kind of are. I mean, of course, the AL East is very top-heavy with New York and Baltimore, and Boston recently caught fire, whereas the American League Central is just top-heavy at the very first spot, with Cleveland being 50 and 26. Minnesota, we know, has been very hot and cold, and the Royals got out to a really good start, then scuffled, and are now trying to work their way back. But this division is now turned into one of the scarier divisions, I think, in all of baseball, but an unpredictable one at that. One you can't really describe because none of these rosters are ridiculously loaded. There's not MVP candidates on every single team. There's really good players, but you look with Baltimore and New York. I mean, New York has two MVP candidates in their same lineup, hitting right behind each other. You know, Baltimore has Gunnar Henderson. They have Adley Rutschman. They have Corbin Burns. You know, Boston feels very AL Central-ish, which is why we talked about it yesterday of, you know, it's that sixth spot in the final wild card, you know, seeding. I think it's going to be which team just didn't bottom out. And I think a lot of teams in the American League are going to bottom out when it comes to September. And it's going to be those teams that are kind of similar to the Royals, either Boston, Tampa, Toronto, Detroit, Texas. If they don't have the steam to go for the entire year, well, that'll probably be why somebody else is sitting in that sixth spot. But as I just mentioned, this coming weekend may be the best and only opportunity the Royals have at making a strong push at Cleveland again. Because you lose that series, all of a sudden you look up and you're 10, 11 games back. And yes, you'll still have half a season to go, but it would take a catastrophic collapse from a Cleveland team that doesn't seem prone to collapsing in 2024. Okay, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, let's go over this bullpen. And is one of these guys emerging in the circle of trust once again? We'll tell you who that is next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can always find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to a few of the sponsors today, starting with Tax Network USA. Here on Locked On Royals, we pride ourselves on getting you the latest news for your team, whether it's the offseason, the draft, spring training, or the playoffs. It's year-round. And you know what else is year-round? Collection season. Just because tax season is over doesn't mean the IRS will stop coming after you for unfiled taxes. The IRS can garnish your wages, levy your bank accounts, and even seize your property. Don't let the IRS target you. Let the licensed professionals and tax experts at Tax Network USA go to bat for you. With over 14 years of experience and an A-plus rating by the Better Business Bureau, Tax Network USA has saved clients over $1 billion in tax debt. Whether you owe taxes, have complicated matters that require tax planning, or finally hit that parlay this season and need help correctly filing, call 1-800-549-1000 or visit tnusa.com/lockedon, and you can see the link in this episode description below. We also want to tell you about our other sponsor in SupplyHouse. Get supplies from the sites that's made for the skilled trade, SupplyHouse.com. SupplyHouse.com is the reliable way to order plumbing, h-vac, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business and talk to a real person every time. Pros in the skilled trade can get you a competitive edge by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trade Master program. Every Trade Master gets access to dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at SupplyHouse.com and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at SupplyHouse.com. I understand this bullpen is a bullpen you don't really trust. And I would say you'd have every right to doubt them after the last 30, 35 games or so. Because we can circle back to the same issues, the same flaws. They don't strike anybody out. They rely on the soft contact. And for some guys, they don't throw enough strikes to be trustworthy arms in the bullpen. However, there's not going to be a scenario in which the Royals add 4 or 5 bullpen arms at the deadline, and all of a sudden it's transformed. I truly do believe the plan for this bullpen is to add a piece or two, back-end arms, high-powered arms, and then you cross your fingers and hope that a lot of these guys that have been struggling or once were lockdown guys and now so much can't be trusted, you go to the side of hoping and praying they return to that form or they have a good month or two and you can ride that into the postseason. I think a perfect example, actually two perfect examples, is Chris Stratton and Will Smith. Chris Stratton and Will Smith were both guys that I think received a lot of criticism going back to May, and it was for an outing or two. Will Smith, it was more so in April. Chris Stratton, more so in May. The interesting part about both of those guys, and I think they are very similar, and the fact that they don't throw very hard, their stuff isn't wipeout at all, but when they go on a good run, it's a really good run. I mean, we're talking 7, 8, 9, 10 consecutive scoreless outings. The ERA continues to drop. I mean, Will Smith's ERA was into like the 100s back in the very beginning part of April because when he took the mound, it just never went well. And then, since that point, his ERA is under 2.5. It might be under 2 after his last couple of outings. And if he does give up a run, it's usually just 1 now. It's not an implosion. And Chris Stratton, kind of the same thing here in the month of June. And I do not think it was a coincidence that last night, when Cole Reagans left the game in the 6th inning, because he was at 108, 110 pitches, they went to Chris Stratton. They went to Chris Stratton and then Schreiber and MacArthur, and they had 3 perfect innings. That was the best those 3 had looked together since April. And it is not to say that's now the fix and the bullpen is great. It's all wonderful, because that's not the case. And I've said constantly, the Royals are going to need to go after some high-powered guys in the bullpen that can have swing and miss stuff, and you can place them in the 8th and 9th inning, or just the 8th inning, or just the 9th inning. And that moves everybody down a spot in the bullpen. That maybe moves MacArthur to the 8th inning and Schreiber to the 7th and Stratton to the 6th, or you can mix and match a little bit better than you can right now. But this is the important part about this bullpen, because I really believe it's who they are. This bullpen is just going to be streaky. I think when they are going well, you're not really going to notice it. They're going to have a stretch of 20 games where their ERA is under 2. They're still not striking out anybody, but they're doing what you paid them to do, which was to induce soft contact, not walk a lot of guys, but it may go unnoticed. Kind of in the way it went unnoticed back in April after they were terrible to begin the year, then hit their groove, more so about the opponents they were facing. But then when things went south, it's so easy to tell that the bullpen is struggling. To me, that is who they are. And I think when they're going well, you see the bullpen have nights like last night. When they're somewhat going well, the bullpen doesn't pitch well at all. And when they're struggling, you know they can be a disaster. So there's really only one time where the bullpen looks phenomenal. And that's, I think, when everything is clicking with the team. And that is kind of the case with a mediocre bullpen. When you don't put them in the high leverage spots that it's on the road, a 1-run game, leadoff double, and they can get out of it with no damage. That's just not going to happen with this bullpen unless they bring in somebody else. But a part of finding this footing is capitalizing when some of these guys, like a Chris Stratton, like a Will Smith, have found their groove. And I think that'll allow Matt Quatrero, whenever he's back, or Paul Hoover tonight, to go to those guys in a 1-run game or a 2-run game and see if they can continue that trend. That, to me, is the roll of the dice you're going with. I don't believe it needs to be John Schreiber in every high leverage spot. I don't believe it always needs to be James MacArthur closing out games in the 9th until they bring in somebody else to be that lockdown guy. You know, I think if they go out there and get a closer like a Carlos Estevez from the Los Angeles Angels, you put him as the closer and MacArthur goes to the 8th inning guy. Then you just try to get creative in the 6th and the 7th. You know, Angel Serpa was the hot hand at one point. Now, not so much. Kind of had the same regression that John Schreiber has had over the last week or two. Now, Schreiber's much longer than Serpa's, but you get my point. It really seen the implosions over the last few weeks or so. And I would like the 6th or 7th inning to be interchangeable unless the Royals get 2 bullpen arms where you could go that new acquired bullpen arm, James MacArthur, and a closer, or MacArthur in the 7th and the new bullpen arm and the new bullpen arm in the 8th and 9th inning. That, to me, is finding the best footing for your bullpen. But until that point of an acquisition, until that point of a trade, which may be here next week, maybe the week after or the week after, we know that J.J. Picollo will act on the market aggressively if he feels like it's the right time. But there also may be some moves that are made closer to the trade deadline, as I'm sure a lot of buyers will be doing at that point in July. Well, before we move on to our final segment, I want to tell you about Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. When we come back, let's dive into Michael Massey's importance and his health and what the Royals can do with a healthy Michael Massey. That's all coming up next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find us on wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and we're on YouTube. Just be sure to hit the follow button and subscribe. For the last time, we'll give a shout out to one of our main sponsors, our title sponsor today, actually, in PrizePicks. It is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. It's also the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And unlike other apps on PrizePicks, it's just you against the numbers. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become a part of the PrizePicks community today. You can win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. And if you're looking for promotions, PrizePicks has you covered every week, from lowering select players' stat projections on Tuesdays to help your lineup hit or getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Friday. And with the finals over, the hoops action doesn't stop as PrizePicks is still going hot with women's basketball, with stars like Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, looking to make names in the league, and you can win up to 100 times your cash watching them all ball out. So download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match of up to $100. Again, that is LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match of up to $100. Well, last night we dove into it a little bit with Michael Massey, Hunter Renfroe, CJ Alexander being this quote-unquote spark for the lineup. And I guess the confidence level that you had in those type of players propelling an offense that hadn't scored since Friday. I mean, it might have been a little too aggressive to call that a spark, because in the end, it was just 2 hits from those 3 players, though one of them was a home run coming off the bat of Hunter Renfroe, and he had been playing since Friday. So Massey and Alexander were the true sparks, and Massey did only have a single in the game. However, I thought it was interesting on the broadcast last night, and we touched on it in the episode yesterday, that the team record and the offense is significantly better when Michael Massey's out there. And I don't think it is a coincidence at all. I don't think it's a small sample size. I think it shows that at the second base position, having a guy like Michael Massey can change this lineup and change the outlook of them heading toward the end of the season or the second half of the season. Massey has what Nick Lofton, Garrett Hampson, and Adam Frazier do not. He has a lot of power. And I think a power for his size and his stature is something that a lot of teams out there would love to have. And I believe if Michael Massey was healthy all year long, I think the second base position would be one of the more valuable ones for the Royals. I think he would have been close to getting more All-Star votes than he did right now. And I think he was 3rd last week, despite missing a large chunk of games. Shows more about the second base position in the American League. But still, Michael Massey was doing one hell of a job before his back flared up again. If he had a clean spring training and a clean first half of the year, I'd be very curious to know what the Royals' record would be, what his numbers would look like, and what the overall offensive numbers would look like. But last night, I think we saw again a moment or two that you could look back to the Michael Massey Royals in, what would that have been, mid-May? It was in the Tampa Bay series, so I think mid-May. And you saw a little bit of that flair, that confidence in the lineup that you hadn't really been seeing over the last couple of weeks, because I think there's a lot more protection in that lineup, even when it's just Michael Massey moving up to the 5 hole. You have Hunter Renfroe back. MJ Melendez is hitting a little bit better and really over the last 15, 16 games or so. And this lineup needs protection. It needs more guys like Michael Massey to help out even the top players like Michael Garcia, Bobby Witt Jr., Vinny Pasquantino, and I think in the case of Michael Massey, helping out guys like Salvador Perez, because Salvador Perez has been in the middle of a terrible slump. A slump that has seen his average go from 340 to like 275. It's been a pretty steep fall off, but I think a large part of that was when Michael Massey went down. When Michael Massey went down, there was not a legitimate 5-hole bat to hit behind Salvador Perez. You could not put Nelson Velasquez there. He's now down in Omaha. You couldn't put MJ Melendez there even when he was going right because the larger sample size would tell you he's not a 5-hole hitter. Hunter Renfroe was banged up, not the exact same time as Michael Massey, but not long after. And then you look at, trying Nick Lofton there, trying Adam Frazier there. None of them really clicked. And this is where I think the offense can take off and might have an opportunity to. I love the fact that Michael Massey, though he's going to be DHing likely until the second half, he's got this chance to provide the protection that Salvador Perez needs. And Salvador Perez being a free swinger, he's going to be exposed and basically taken out of the lineup by the opposing pitcher when there's nobody to hit behind him. Why throw him anything close to the zone when we don't have to worry about somebody behind him driving him in or putting somebody on base and now you got to deal with a powerful bat in the 5-hole. Michael Massey, for all the options they put in the 5-hole, was the most consistent bat. Before the injury, I would say when he first come back off the injured list, because he started the year on the injured list, came back, and then he played for a while, played really well, in my opinion, and then the back injury flared up. And I think that would be one of the worst things for this lineup right now, is then losing him for a third time to this back injury. So slow playing it is very, very important, and I think incredibly important for a second half push. You have Michael Massey in the 5 spot. I think it makes this lineup tremendously better because it's another bat you just have to think about a little bit more when facing the Royals lineup. I think when you were dealing with Adam Frazier, you weren't really concerned with him doing a ton of damage. Even though Garrett Hampson has exceeded some expectations, you're not worried about him doing damage. Nick Lofton had been hitting better, but I think when he got thrust into the leadoff spot, it kind of put him in a tailspin as well. I like him coming off the bench a little bit more, being that super utility guy. But when Michael Massey's healthy, he just needs to be the second baseman every single day. And maybe you're listening and questioning, why am I so high on Michael Massey when last year he wasn't that valuable of a bat? I think he showed in the limited time that he played this year that there is more to his game than just running into a home run every once in a while. I don't like the fact he doesn't walk a lot, but he puts the ball in play a lot. And this year, he's found more luck than he did last year. And I think the most important part is Salvador Perez has to get going again. Salvador Perez has to maybe not get to where he was at the beginning of the year, but he can't be this 170 hitter for the next 2 to 3 months, and the Royals expect to make the playoffs. A big part in those numbers improving is having a reliable 5th-hole hitter and not just gambling on the upside of, well, Nelson Velasquez might be able to do it, or, well, MJ's hot, let's see if he can do it, or Adam Frazier can work the count and, maybe do some damage. But if Salvador Perez is on first base, Adam Frazier's not hitting gappers to score Salvador Perez. Michael Massey can put ones over the fence. And it may be a little bit of time until he's doing that again, because maybe it's just, taking it slow, taking it easy, not maxing out on all your swings, having more of a smooth approach, just a nice, clean swing. So even if he is more of a singles hitter and he can go to all fields, that's better than anybody they've really had in the 5th hole all year, with the exception of Michael Massey before the back injury flared up again. But hopefully we see him back in there tonight, because they're doing this DH thing with him moving forward. I'd imagine they can play him more often than if he was playing both the field and hitting in the game, because that might give him an off day or two, so they really don't overexert him at this point in the season. But since he DH'd last night, I'm hoping to see him back in the lineup again, because I think this lineup is tremendously better with more of a consistent bat in the 5 hole. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson, and you can always find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give one last shout out to Locked On Sports Today. It's here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day of the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now, available on the free Fire TV channels app. Now, tomorrow we will break down not only Game 2 of this series, but likely Game 3 as well, as the Royals will wrap up their series with the Marlins tomorrow afternoon. And maybe we'll give a quick preview into the Cleveland Guardians series, as they'll be here for 4 games over Thursday through Sunday. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.